Good evening, everyone. It's such a blessing to be able to speak to you all tonight. I've been blessed by this study. I hope that you have as well. One of the things that I've enjoyed the most about the study that we're doing is the pace, the fast pace that we've been going through. And some of you might be thinking, well, one of the hardest things about the study is the pace, and I think I would agree with you there too. But by going through the books in such rapid succession, it's really given a clear picture of the bigger story that's at play about God and His redemption of His people, and that I've really thoroughly enjoyed. As we get into the Pre-Exilic Prophets, these are 9 of the 12 minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. I wanted to start off by doing a quick recap of the story so far that we've seen, just to kind of catch us all up, because I think it's really important. So originally, God creates man, and almost immediately, man rebels against God, which begins this endless cycle of disobedience, ultimately culminating to Genesis chapter 6, where every inclination of every thought of man was always evil all the time. And God answers that by sending the flood and pressing reset, basically, starting all over. But shortly after the flood, we read that the world basically went right back to where it was beforehand. So that reset didn't quite, do what it was intended. So what God does is He changed tactics, right? He enters into covenant with Abraham and his family. He picks out this one group of people, this one tribe, and says, "I'm going to call you to live by my ways." That family goes through all sorts of tops and turns, lots of different characters there that we see, different situations with Isaac, Jacob, Esau, etc. Ultimately, with Joseph himself getting put into slavery, but then getting risen up as the leader of Egypt, the second in command. Israelites prosper there, and then they're enslaved, and they experience their first real captivity at the hands of Pharaoh. So what does God do? God rescues them. God brings them out of Egypt through miracles, plagues, wonders, signs, such amazing, awesome things. He introduces them to the law, and He's introducing them to His way, His better way of living for their society. But they're constantly rebellious in the desert. Ultimately, they refuse to go into the promised land. And they have to, God says, I'm kind of had it with you. I'm going to start a new generation. And, ultimately, we know Joshua leads a second generation who does conquer the promised land, but they fall a little short. They don't destroy all of the inhabitants of the land. And this, as we have already read, it comes back to bite them later. So now they're in the promised land. God has done all of these wonderful things for them. He has led them by fire by night, by cloud by the day. He's saved them from all sorts of enemies. He's won all sorts of battles. And yet they say, we want a king, just like everybody else. We want a physical ruler. So once again, Israel they don't quite get it, the Israelites. So God gives them what they want. Saul's raised up, and because of his pride, he's quickly lowered back down. But we're introduced to David, and David is interesting. David is a man after God's own heart. And David does wonderful things. He gathers all of these resources for the temple, which we didn't quite read about, but it's in the books of Chronicles. He gathers the resources ready to build God a house, which his son Solomon ultimately builds. And now God has a permanent dwelling among His people. They have this amazing Passover feast, and it's like Israel has finally reached the pinnacle of what God wanted them to be at this point. But sadly, that doesn't last, because shortly thereafter, Rehoboam, Solomon's own son, splits the kingdom. It was a little splintered already before that point, but Rehoboam makes it real final, right? And once the kingdom split, Jeroboam puts those 2 calves in the northern kingdom, and boom, idolatry just reigns throughout the land, ultimately, heavy idol worship. In addition to idolatry, injustice reigns. So all of the scriptures in Leviticus and Deuteronomy about taking care of the poor and your fellow man and taking care of your neighbor and loving it all kind of goes by the wayside. And we witnessed as the kingdoms of Israel just went through this crazy, tumultuous downfall. Bottom line, I think, of this story so far is that no matter what God does, man seeks to worship other gods. no matter what. Like, tried all sorts of different tactics, and man continues to just look after other gods. And God himself kind of says this in Hosea 11:7, where he says, "My people are determined to turn from me." Now, some of you, like me, getting to this point in the Bible, for the last few weeks especially, been reading this and say, man, when's God going to do something about this? These people are just out of their minds. They're doing these heinous acts. And this is the God, this is the holy, awesome, Yahweh, Jehovah. This is the God who had the mountain that you couldn't touch because it's too holy. And if you touched it, you died. Where is he? Why isn't he punishing these people? And what's interesting is that, this very question is the question that some of the prophets were struggling with themselves. Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 2 and 3 says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you don't save? Why do you make me look at injustice, and why do you tolerate wrongdoing?" And so the prophets themselves were asking for God's judgment, and sure enough, God's judgment does in fact come in these books. And the thing I love the most about these books and about the prophets in general is that we get a real glimpse of God's heart here. Up until this point, the Bible has been mostly a narrative about the mankind and specifically the people chosen by God. And God was there, but he was kind of like a side character. He had a role and he did amazing things. But here in the prophets, the narrative switches, and it's first person. It's right from God himself speaking. And so I think if we look closely, we get to see some great, wonderful takeaways for ourselves today, because we see the very heart of God and what he wants from his people. So what is the rough timeline we're talking about here? Okay, so these dates are estimates, but we're talking about 850 BC to 600 BC. And during this time period, as we've just finished reading, we watched and witnessed the downfall of the northern kingdom of Israel as it went into Assyrian captivity. And then we witnessed the downfall of the kingdom of Judah as it went into Babylonian captivity. And these 9 prophets are really scattered throughout this section of time, the last 250 years of the kingdoms of Israel. And they each address a different audience, particular audience. Some overlap, and they have different themes. Some overlap. There are some common themes I think we could take away from that we'll talk about in just a minute. But like one of the commonalities was like Jonah and Nahum. You see here, Jonah goes to Nineveh and preaches to Nineveh. Nineveh repents. Oh, amazing, wonderful. But just a few generations later, Nineveh forgot their repentance. They ultimately grow very, very large into a large, very imperialistic nation, and they take captive of the northern kingdom. They invade Israel. So that Nahum, on the other side, condemns them for their heinous violence, heinous acts, and the terrible things they've done. So some similarities here, and condemnation is not just for Israel, but for the kingdoms throughout that area who've been doing vile and heinous things. And so I titled this section Rough Timeline because it is really a guess in many ways. Some of you who are looking really closely might notice there are 2 Obadiahs and 2 Joels on this map, and that's for purpose, for good reason. These are 2 very small books. Obadiah is a single chapter, the shortest Old Testament book, and neither one really dates themselves very well. There was an Obadiah back in 1 Kings chapter 18, some of you may remember, who with Elijah, he hid 100 prophets from Jezebel. That's at the same time that Elijah was trying to flee from her. And that could be the Obadiah that we're talking about here, that some scholars believe. Obadiah is talking to Edom, and Edom are the descendants of Esau from Jacob and Esau. So Edom, he was condemning Edom for not taking care of their brother Israel when another invading army was coming and taking them over and hurting them. And that happened actually twice in history. So it happens by the Philistines and the Arabs invaded Israel early on. That's in the 850 BC time period. And that could be our Obadiah who was with Elijah. But it also happened later on when Babylon came and took Judah. And Edom participated in selling their brothers, their brother Israel, and their cousins, the Israelites. They participated in selling them and plundering their village and all of that. So Obadiah could be talking about those 2 things. Joel, similarly, a lot of original scholars thought he was in one of the older books. But if you actually read Joel, he references a lot of thoughts and ideas that come from other prophets. So even Ezra and Nehemiah, who are actually after the exile. So those 2 books could actually be on either side, either the oldest or the newest of the 9 prophets. But you know what? It really doesn't matter. because the message is timeless. And I think if we look closely at these 9 small books, we can actually pull out derivatives of that we see in the New Testament. We can see Jesus' own teachings in these 9 books, these 9 very, very old books, if we look carefully. And hopefully we'll be able to look at that together a bit. So what are the common themes that I think we can pull away today in the 21st century from these 9 books? Despite the different audiences and the different messages, there are definitely things that we can draw from. And I see there are 4 of them. So this phrase, the day of the Lord, it appears 25 times in these 9 books, sorry. And it means 2 different things. It's really a double-sided, double-edged sword. It's destruction and then redemption. That comes with it. So if you look at the story of Hosea, that's a really good picture. Hosea is a visual prophetic image of what God does with his people. He tells them to marry Gomer, an unfaithful woman or a scandalous woman, however it's interpreted. And she, of course, she does, in fact, become unfaithful. And God says, no, go get her, buy her back from her other men that she's entertaining and bring her back home, because I'm going to do this with my people, Israel. So I want you just to stop for a minute and put yourself in that shoe, in his shoes. Imagine your spouse, or imagine your best friend. Your best friend is gonna betray you in a way that you could never imagine. Commit adultery, maybe frame you for a crime that's going to send you to prison for the rest of your life. But they just betray your trust in such a way that is what some might in the world say is unforgivable, quote unquote. Would you be thinking about, how would you respond? Think about that for a minute. What would you do with that knowledge? Would you be thinking, man, I'm gonna stop them from doing it, or I'm gonna plan my revenge, or I'm never gonna talk to them again, whatever the human instinct might be? Or would you be thinking how much you love them and planning for them planning to forgive them when it was all over? Because that's what God did. Hosea chapter 11, verse 8 through 11, starts out with this phrase where just after that verse we just read about my people are determined to turn from me, he says, but how can I give you up, Ephraim? And talks about his love for his people and makes a decision, really almost like a covenant, that because of his own love, he's going to forgive them, and he's going to bring them back and bring back the remnant. And not only that, but he pleads with them to restore the relationship back in Hosea 14. This is how God thinks. It's not how I think, not naturally at least, but it's how God thinks. And it's just amazing. If we look at Micah chapter 2, Micah 2 verses 12 and 13. So in Micah's 1-3, he's in the middle of condemning both Israel and Judah for their heinous acts. And yet right smack in the middle in verse 12 of chapter 2, he says, I will surely gather all of you, Jacob. I will surely bring together the remnants of Israel. I will bring them together like the sheep in the pen, like a flock in its pasture. The place will throng with people. The one who breaks open the way will go up before them. They will break through the gate, go out, and the king will pass before them, the Lord at their head. So right in the middle of this judgment that is well-deserved, God is giving them a picture of the future. And that picture, in so many ways in these books, is a messianic promise. And it's a messianic promise for not just Israel, but really for all nations. Here, this part of the Bible, so far, there's maybe been a hint of a redeemer, but this is where we really see the Messiah come into play. It's very strongly for the first time. Amos chapter 9 says, in that day I will restore David's fallen shelter, repair the broken walls, restore its ruins, and rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and all nations that bear my name declare the Lord, who will do these things. Joel chapter 2, it's a scripture we're all very familiar with, especially when any of us have gone to the Coming of the Kingdom study. He says, I will pour out my spirit on all people, and everyone who calls in the name of the Lord will be saved. Zephaniah chapter 2 verse 11 says, the Lord will be awesome to them when he destroys all the gods of the earth. Distant nations will bow down to him, all of them in their own lands. And look at us now, scattered across New York, all bowing down to the Lord our God in our own lands. It's just amazing when you really put this into context. Like this is the fulfillment of what Jesus ultimately does later on. These books sum up, in short, the entire arc of the Bible. It's God's love, followed by man's rebellion, followed by more of God's love, followed by man's redemption. It's a visual image of the gospel right here in the Old Testament, quote unquote. So then there are these two warnings that are also included. And I think these are also things that we can take very seriously and we can apply to our own lives. So first is this warning of false worship. Now, what is false worship? Well, Israel got the whole worship God, go to temple, give your tithes and your offerings. They got that whole thing down pat. But they really missed the mark, especially when it came to getting at the heart of God, which was to take care of the poor, the weak, their fellow man, their fellow brother. They just missed that mark. If you look at Amos talks a lot about this. So Amos chapters 2, 4, and 5 all talk about how they trampled the poor, they oppressed them, they sold them into slavery. And it uses the phrase, they sold them for a pair of sandals. Imagine taking the brother Darren and saying, all right, I'm going to sell for a pair of sandals. That's just such a foreign thing, but this is what they were doing while going to church, going to temple and praising God. It's just so baffling. And Amos 5 goes on to say how God actually hates their religious festivals. He hates their sacrifices. He despises their sacrifices and their offerings because they completely disregarded those passages that we just read a couple months ago in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that were talking about how you don't harden your hearts against the brother in need. You let your brothers don't harvest the edge of your crop, but let them glean, right? I mean, you saw the story of Ruth and Boaz, where she was able to glean off the crop of her fellow brother, kinsman redeemer. Don't trample the poor, but take care of them. This is the God. In short, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? That sums it all up. So what about us? And how does that apply to us? Well, we go to church. Maybe we go physically, maybe we go virtually. We sing songs, we give contribution, maybe we read the Bible with our family, we preach the gospel. Does it end there? Does that mean, great, we've done it, we're the people of God, we do all the right things? Something that challenged me as I was reading these books, that cut me to the heart myself, was, what are you doing to transform the world that's around you? What are you doing to make an impact, to be that salt and light, and looking for ways to serve the community, serve others, to be Jesus to the people around us? These are the challenges that I think the pre-exilic prophets bring to us in 2021, and they really should convict us and challenge us to look for ways to do even more. Right? We got to come down from that mountaintop, right, as the acapella song says, and go to the people of the valley below, and not only just bring the gospel to them, but serve and love them as well. There are physical needs as well as spiritual needs that need to be met. The last warning is about idol worship. So Israel worshiped God and Baal. they would bring their offerings to the Lord, and they would also bring their offerings to Baal, to Asherah, to all the others in the high places. At one point, they're bringing actual idols into the temple of the Lord. Manasseh does that, right? And it's incredible. They thought they were okay by worshiping all the gods, if you will. Okay, let's cover all our bases, right? It's kind of what they might have been thinking. Remember those golden calves Jeroboam created, right? I mean, why did they think that was okay? Hosea chapter 2, verse 8 says that she, talking about Israel, she has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So the Israelites took the blessings given from God himself, the blessings from the promised land that they were in, the blessings from prosperity he has given them along the way. And then they took that and offered it to Baal, offered it to an idol. Amos chapter 4, verses 4 and 5 says, go to Bethel and sin, go to Gilgal and sin more. Bring your sacrifices every morning. Bring your tithes every 3 years. Burn leavened bread as a thank offering, and brag about your free will offerings. Boast about them, you Israelites, for this is what you love to do, declares the sovereign Lord. He's kind of being sarcastic here. They were doing all the right things, quote unquote. They're going to temple, they're contribution, they praise the Lord. But yet at the same time, they're following after these other gods. So again, what about us? How do we bring it back? What about me? Do I go to church? I go to church every Sunday. I'm even physically there during COVID and I'm praising the Lord, or I'm virtual during COVID and I'm, spending so much time with my family in the Bible, talking about great things and praying and all these great things, but then secretly chasing after other gods. So if God was to peruse my Instagram feed, would he feel glorified by that? Or if God was BCC'd on every email I sent at work for those corporate folks in the room, would we change what we said, knowing God was BCC'd on every one? We don't have Baals and Ashtoreths for sure today, but we certainly have money, success, jobs, things that we could potentially serve a little more than we serve God. So a real challenging one for me lately is, are we gonna? Yeah, I got the cue. We're wrapping up. Real challenging for us, in recent months is: do we pledge allegiance to our country? Do we pledge allegiance to God? Because in some ways you can get away with both, but in many ways you can't. If someone looked at my Facebook page, let's get real, would they think immediately, man, that guy's a Christian? Or would they think, wow, that guy's a Republican? Or wow, that guy's a Democrat, a socialist, or something else? Or a director of IPS that directs software? Like what does the world see when they look at us? So as we move to the exile here, I put this QR code up here because there's a great video that talks about how the way of the exile. And what it does is we move into the exile, we're going to get to the people of Israel where we're going to relate to them in a different way, where they're going to be foreigners in a strange land with strange gods and strange people all around them, and yet they're called to live holy lives in God. And I think that's something we can really relate to. So I just encourage you to take a snapshot of that and check out that video as we head into the exile. And thank you very much for giving me time today.